Prop 15, one of the hottest propositions in the state. Big changes to Prop 13. And today we have County Assessor Larry Stone of Santa Clara County. Stay tuned. Larry, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Well, we are from Sunnyvale, the Kapowich family, and I know you got a big start here. And you, by the way, were former mayor and councilman.
Yes, sir.
And speaking
16 and a half years as a council member and mayor of the great city of Sunnyvale.
Okay, because we only have 27 minutes. If we did your resume, we'd only have a couple of minutes to talk about these propositions. So I invite anyone to go on to LinkedIn and look at your impressive resume. Now, I believe that you were a councilman when Prop 13 was coming down the pike.
Yes, I was a young council member back then in Sunnyvale in June of 1978 when Proposition 13 was on the ballot and passed.
Okay, now, if I remember correctly, you weren't a big fan of it.
No, actually, I worked against, I was an opponent of Proposition 13. I think it's one of the two worst things that has ever happened to California. I actively campaigned against it. And I openly acknowledge that Prop 13 gives an advantage to commercial and industrial property owners. There's inequities there. They don't pay their fair share of property taxes. So I'm asked, well, then why are you opposed to Proposition 15, which amends Proposition 13? And it's my responsibility as the assessor to tell people that it's seriously flawed and would be bad for California taxpayers, for assessors, and of course the California property tax system.
Okay, now that was part of your presentation. You had mentioned the good thing about Prop 13 is you have a steady flow of income that you could count on.
Correct. Proposition 13, probably their only good thing, but it's a very important thing, and it established predictability for property taxes all over California. I think Proposition 15, in fact, creates unpredictability.
Now, in terms of the assessing needs, I believe the commercial properties, Safeway, Apple, etc., would have to be reassessed on a regular basis?
Yes, Proposition 15, basic premise is to reassess all commercial industrial properties to market value every 3 years. They use a 3-year term so they can spread the workload, if you will, over a 3-year period.
Now, of course, that would require commercial appraisers.
Yes, well, right now I have about 50 commercial property, actually 50 appraisers. So I would have to double my appraisal staff from 50 to well over 100 in order to accommodate or to implement Proposition 15. That skill set, that appraisal skill set does not exist in the industry. The appraisal profession has been on a downhill slide since the S&L debacle in the late 1990s. So, and they could not be entry-level appraisers. They'd have to be experienced appraisers who could appraise and therefore assess shopping centers and office buildings. So it takes me 5 years to take an entry-level appraiser with a college degree and train and provide the experience for that appraiser so they can appraise and assess shopping centers and office buildings. Proposition 15 gives the assessor only 18 months.
The staffing of that would, now in the past when you brought in these balanced budgets and you've actually given a surplus back to the state or the county.
Yeah,
right?
That's true. The first assessment, I'm required by the California Constitution to close the assessment roll every July 1st. That's a constitutional responsibility. There's no overtime, there's no extra innings. July 1st is the date. The first roll I closed in 1995, that was the first roll when I was the assessor. The assessed value of all real and business property was $115 billion. Now remember that number. The roll I just closed this last July was $551 billion, an increase of 379%. My staff, in terms of the number, has gone up 12% in 25 years.
Larry, I think most people would be surprised that there is an association of county assessors. And I know you've been active in that association. In fact, when you get together, people would come to you and say, what's happening in Silicon Valley? And I know you're on the chair. I believe you're on the chair this year, and you had a lot to do with Prop 15. You saw it coming, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, the California Assessors Association consists of all 58 county assessors in the state. And we've been looking at the possibility of what's called a split roll before it became Proposition 15. The California Assessors Association completed a comprehensive analysis of Proposition 15. And with one thing in mind, and that, can we implement it? The assessors stay out of revenue issues, so we were only interested in whether we could implement Proposition 15, and we have concluded we cannot. Proposition 15 would be impossible, not difficult, but impossible for assessors to implement. So revenue is only good if it can be generated, and the assessors have concluded that it can.
Okay. Now, you had mentioned speaking in the past about the LAO. Can you speak to that organization?
Yes, the Legislative Analyst's Office their job is to look at ballot measures like this and draw conclusions, not whether they're for it or against it, but to evaluate the economic and financial impact that they would have. And the proponents of Proposition 15 claim that it would generate $11.4 billion in the first 18 months. That's what the ballot measure says, and that's what their analysts said. Well, the LAO said, well, that's not true. It would start generating revenue in 18 months, but it wouldn't conclude until 25, 26. So the arguments that the proponents are making are inconsistent with the facts.
Okay, because you had mentioned that, which one is it? They were going to give you 18 months to implement it. And there's a juxtaposition of when you start to have it roll out, when you start collecting the money, as opposed to when it comes in.
The independent report prepared by the proponents says right on the front, and is dated May 4th, 2020, that $11.4 billion worth of additional property tax revenue would be generated by 21-22. The LAO says that won't happen until 25, 26. And I told you that it takes me 5 years to train an entry-level appraiser.
Right.
So the point is that in 5 years we could do it, but not in 18 months.
Okay, and again, you talked about how it's predictable for the Prop 13, but the split roll would be unpredictable.
It creates unpredictability. As I tell all local governments and school boards, don't start to budget for this revenue yet, because it's not going to happen.
And yet, speaking to that, you mentioned it might be tied up in the courts for a while.
Yeah, it's an invitation for commercial property owners to adjudicate disputes over the assessed value, not before the local assessment appeals board, but in the courts. And of course, that's much more costly, more time consuming. Appeals, when they're adjudicated in the superior court, can take years to resolve. And that also impacts residential appeals. So if you file an appeal on your residential property, don't expect that it be done in a year or two. It's going to go on forever, because we will, meaning the assessors, will be dealing with very complex commercial appeals that would be filed in the courts.
Yes, you had mentioned that before, given an example of a big court case that took years to settle and cost a lot of money to boot. Now, let's get to the shopping strips, the small business people. Can you describe triple net? How does triple net work for the dry cleaner and a small restaurant? What does that mean for a small business.
The single biggest problem with Prop 15 and why I believe it'll fail is the false claim by the proponents of Proposition 15 that it excludes small businesses from reassessment every 3 years. It does not. That's a fabrication. Most small businesses don't pay their property taxes. Great, they don't own property. So they pay their property taxes in what's called the triple net lease. They pay a proportion or a percentage of the space that they have related to the property tax that the owner pays. So they make a claim that small businesses would be excluded from paying higher property taxes, and that's not true.
And you thought that a lot of small businesses would suffer and perhaps close.
Absolutely. You know, the independent restaurant, the cleaners, the nail and hair salons, gift stores, grocery stores, dentists, small accountants and attorneys could see their property taxes go up 8, 9, 10 times. Not 8, 9, or 10%, but 8 or 9, 10 times in the very first year of Proposition 15.
Okay, you also mentioned that 50% of commercial property is occupied by small businesses.
Something like that. I mean,
something like that. Yeah, it's a good estimate.
In terms of numbers, it's probably more properties are owned by small businesses, or at least occupied by small businesses than larger property.
Okay. Now you also, now this is of course going with properties are going up, but what if they go down? You spoke about in the Great Recession, all that reassessment that took place during the greatest recession.
During the Great Recession, we proactively reduced the assessed value, meaning without being asked by the property owners, for 136,000 properties, we reduced the assessed value on. That's almost 1/4 of all the properties in the county. That reduced the assessment roll by $127 billion. Fast forward to today. If we had another Great Recession where property values dropped as much as 50% in some areas of this county, you would see, so you're reassessed to market value according to Proposition 15 if you're a commercial property owner in year 1. Well, what happens if another Great Recession comes along, and they always do periodically, or another COVID recession comes along, and your property values drop by 50%? But you've just been reassessed just last year to market value. So the benefit of spreading this over 3 years doesn't exist, because now we'd have to reduce on an annual basis to reflect the declining market during a recession, the assessed value of your property.
Okay, and that gets back into, you mentioned earlier, you're going to need 50 new experienced commercial appraisers.
Yeah,
for going up and going down.
Statewide, that would be between 1,100 and 1,500 new appraisers, experienced appraisers, experienced enough to appraise shopping centers and office buildings. And as I said, that skill set does not exist in the industry.
You had given the example, imagine the 25,000 appeals for Google and LinkedIn, it would just be endless.
Yes, I mean, the one thing that would happen is assessment appeals would skyrocket. Anybody that owned property, any commercial property owner that owned their property, pick a year before 2008, 2009, 2010, every single one of them would file an appeal. So last year we got 2,100 commercial appeals in my office, and that's pretty normal. During the Great Recession, when we had a big downturn, obviously, we got 12,000 appeals in 2009. We conservatively estimate that we'd get 25,000 appeals in Santa Clara County in the very first year of Proposition 15, more than double what it was in the first year of the Great Recession. There's no possible way, impossible again, for assessors to resolve 25,000 appeals. So what would we do to accommodate that? We'd do exactly what we did during the Great Recession. We would transfer our appraisal resources over from enrolling new construction which is where the real current money is for schools and local government, we transfer those resources, as we did during the Great Recession, over to defending appeals. That seems to be counterproductive to the benefit of schools and local government.
As well as there's a housing shortage, we need new housing units.
In fact,
Now you had mentioned in the past, there's you're not belly aching, you're just speaking truth to power here, so to speak, and that there's an alternative.
there is an alternative. I get asked the question, well, if Proposition 15 doesn't work, is there an option? And the option is a split rate rather than a split roll. Simply change the tax rate for all commercial and industrial properties from 1%, which it is statewide, change it for commercial industrial properties to 1.2%, 1.5%, whatever. That would generate revenue immediately. It would not create any of the problems that I just described to you with Proposition 15. Every tax collector in the state would simply reprogram their computers for all commercial industrial properties to a higher tax rate, and it would generate revenue easily, quickly, without the problems that I mentioned.
Okay, and so do you think that the reason they didn't do that, was it too simple, or has that been floated before? Why?
Well, it wouldn't change the inequities of Proposition 13. The inequities would still be there. So you've got two types of proponents for Proposition 15. You've got the ones that just believe that schools and local government should get more revenue. I concur with that. The intent of Proposition 15 is good. The operations are bad. There's others, people that are so obsessed with changing the inequities. They're so angry at Disneyland and Intel and other properties owners that have owned their property for a long period of time. And I'm saying, if you want revenue, then the best way to get it quickly and easily is through a split rate. If you want to try to do it difficultly, then the Prop 15. What Prop 15 is trying to do is change 42 years of inequity in the system, and I acknowledge that exists. 42 years of inequity with a simple, convoluted, one-time ballot measure on November 3rd.
Now, Larry, while I have you, what I'd like you to do, you're one of the greatest speakers here in the real estate community when you come and give us a chat. You've spoken in the past about our tech economy is very volatile. And we, of course, I was there with you, so to speak, in the early 90s with the S&L crisis. If we just do a quick round robin on these downturns, the S&L crisis, and of course we had the aerospace industry collapse as well.
Yeah, I've been through, in 25 years, I've been through 3 or 4 downturns. We always have them, and we always will have them periodically. But let me compare briefly the Great Recession, which was a residential recession. It was really based upon mortgage fraud that created that. So the properties that dropped in value were homes and condominiums. This recession, the COVID recession, is a commercial recession. It's commercial properties that have been ordered to close, that are no longer open, that are being hit. So the next year's assessment roll will see significant declines in the assessment, therefore the property values of shopping centers, office buildings, industrial properties, and so forth.
Now this COVID recession is different. Well, compare that to the Great Recession residential, and then the dot-com boom and bust, where you used to say, you know, these companies, they don't own the land, they don't own the building, they don't have any money, and they're not making any money.
Well, that's why some people, some economists believe that the recovery from this recession will be more rapid and not as deep as the recovery was from the Great Recession. The Great Recession never fully recovered until about 2015. So, but if you look at the dot-com bust, when we went from the dot-com boom to the dot-com bust, commercial properties that were largely built by speculative developers collapsed. Well, nowadays, these buildings are being built by solid companies, sustainable companies like Apple, Google, LinkedIn, NVIDIA, Adobe. So the base, the security base of the property values of the commercial property values in Silicon Valley is much stronger than it was during the Great Recession. That bodes good for the future of the tech industry here.
Okay, while I have you, I need you to touch on, because you've spoken about the S&L crisis / the recession of the early 90s, the S&L crisis. That was also residential fraud with those savings and loans.
But it actually hit the commercial properties because the savings and loans
Right.
were loaning money to developers
Right.
without much security. And so the office buildings, it was called the RTC, the Resolution Trust Corporation, which the federal government was taking back thousands of office buildings and shopping centers to save them from foreclosure.
Right. Now, in some of your talks here, you talk about with the economy, the stock market is not the economy. And I know you worked on Wall Street as a young man. What did you mean by that?
Well, I did. I mean, people say, well, how can the recession here be so bad and Wall Street's been so good? Well, Wall Street is not the economy. Investors only look forward. They don't look backward. And so what that tells you is they have a lot of confidence in the ability of American industry to recover from the COVID recession. That's good news. But, you know, it does not, the stock market does not reflect the current economy. Okay. It never has.
Now we have all these different, the alphabet soup here of recoveries, the U, the V, the W, the K recovery. Can you speak to those briefly?
Well, the U, the V is the one that everybody's hoping for, and that is a very rapid downturn and a rapid recovery. The U is a slower one. It's just like the letter U is. But there's something new in the alphabet soup here, and that's the K recovery, where the upward part of the K is Wall Street, major residential properties, and so forth. And the bottom side, the bottom line of the K is the normal economy, which just exacerbates the inequities that exist today between the haves and the have-nots. And that's the one people worry about the most. And that is where everybody will benefit. All the wealthy folks and the major corporations and major real estate interests will benefit on the upside, and the inequities for average people and homeowners and working people will continue to decline. That is the worst scenario that we could have.
Okay, now the W, you have to touch on the W. Is that a double dip? Is that a...
Yeah, the double is that you recover quickly, but a new surge in the coronavirus, COVID, takes hold and we go down again.
Okay, now that reminds me, because I've been hearing that less than half of Americans are wearing masks and being careful about the virus. So I agree with you. I think you've mentioned that we have to get a hold of the virus before we get the economy together. Yes,
economists and economic analysis is at the mercy of a vaccine. We will never come out of this recovery, out of this recession, until we have a vaccine where people have trust and confidence that going to a restaurant is not going to get them sick, that going back to their jobs is not going to create a problem for them medically. And so the race for a vaccine is a race to the recovery of the economy. They're equal.
Now, you have seen this Silicon Valley's unemployment drop many times in your service to our county. Can you speak to that in terms of the job loss in February and April, that 31%? We've recovered 31% since February and April?
We've recovered about 30% of all the jobs we lost. But understand, in January of this year, unemployment was at 2.3%. It topped out at about 15% in June or so. and it's now down to 7.9% in Silicon Valley. So we're on the right path, but it's not anywhere near the 2.3% we had at the beginning of the year.
The economist, you spoke in your presentation about Chris Thornburg of Beacons Economics.
Yeah, Chris, I respect Chris a lot. He's a leading economist in the state of California. And he believes that this recovery is going to be quicker than the recoveries that we've seen in the dot-com bust or the Great Recession. And he says we meaning Silicon Valley, went into this downturn with such a solid economy that we will come back from it quicker. And that the tech industry, jobs that were lost, at least at the beginning of this recession, were lost because the companies were closed where people worked. Different than the other recessions that we talked about in the past. Now, there's still strength here. The real estate markets, because of what I mentioned earlier, are very strong long-term. People are still investing here long-term. So they believe that the economy is strong enough that when we get a vaccine, that it'll recover much quicker. And Chris Thornburg believes that.
And of course, and that's because some of the temporary furloughs, some of them became permanent.
The longer this goes on, the longer the recovery to normalcy. So hopefully we'll get this resolved quicker and get back to normal, because the economy is, basic parts of the economy are still very strong.
We're going to, you often spoke about the millennials. Can you speak about the millennials in their one-click world in closing? 30 seconds.
Well, millennials are totally different than the rest of us, but they're the major force in the workforce right now, and they view things differently. So they're the reason why we're so heavily engaged. They grew up in a one-click world where things are expected very quickly and very efficiently. And if they rule out, if they win, that's going to be good for the economy.
Of course, a lot of the malls are going to be closing, so they don't plan to go to the malls anyway, right? They're just going to order online.
A leading retail economist projects that 1,100 of the malls in the United States will close in the next 4 years. Retail is in terrible shape, and it will not recover to anywhere near it was before this.
Larry Stone, one of the smartest men I know. Thank you for coming on the show. I hope you come back real soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again for watching Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. We will see you next week.